Full frame versus APS-C. Do you need a full frame camera? Is the goal to get a full frame camera? Is there a quality difference? Can you be a professional with an APS-C camera? Is the image quality better? How about low light? We're going to try to answer all those questions in this video. I'm going to cover everything I possibly can about full frame versus APS-C. A full frame sensor is about the same size as 35mm film. So digital sensors usually have some type of correlation between the sensor size and film size. So back in the day when everything was recorded on film, 35mm was pretty much the standard, and for photos, 35mm film ran through the camera horizontally. But when you're filming movies, the 35mm film ran through the camera vertically. So in the movie world, they call this format Super 35, which is about the same size as an APS-C sensor. But when shooting photos, since the film is fed in horizontally, you can use more of the film, and that is equivalent to the full frame. If you fast forward to the digital age, I think this is where the debate started. APS-C cameras have smaller sensors, which means they don't cost as much to develop. These cameras and lenses are often much smaller than their full frame counterparts. And with that being said, companies can make these cameras more affordable. Pros don't mind spending more money because they're making money with their camera. So a pro will spend $10,000 on the camera body if that camera is going to bring them in much more than $10,000. So what made business sense? A brand can make APS-C cameras cheap and more affordable, and they can dedicate the full frame cameras to more professional users that cost more money. The new wave of electric cars is a good example of this. Because electric technology is new and it costs a lot of money to research and develop at the moment, it is going to be very expensive, which means that it makes more sense for them to develop electric cars in the luxury category than it does for the budget category. Luxury car buyers aren't necessarily looking for the best deal. So any price increase from it being electric is not as bad as it would be if you was doing this in a budget line. And as the development cost comes down and the technology gets more accessible, you start seeing more electric cars on an affordable scale. That's the point I think we are in the camera world. So APS-C cameras weren't as good as the full frame cameras because they didn't have the same level of effort put into those cameras. Nowadays, there are a lot of heavy hitting APS-C cameras on the market, and the gap between the quality and full frame APS-C is very small. So let's talk about how these differences impact your work. A lot of times when you talk about APS-C cameras, people are concerned about the level of quality, they're concerned about whether or not they're good enough in low light, and a lot of people talk about how you can't get the level of background blur or bokeh from an APS-C camera. I've already addressed that historically the quality differences between the two systems have been because of the level of effort that these systems have been given. I started on a Canon T5i, and at the time Canon had the 5D Mark IV, which was a full frame professional camera, and the quality difference between the two is massive. But now if I show you the differences between an A6700 and an A7C II, you wouldn't notice the quality difference even if you zoomed in and pixel peeped. So if you're worried about professional quality, you can just scratch that concern off the list for cameras nowadays. Now let's talk about background blur, because that is a hot topic. Some say get a full frame camera if you want more background blur. Some say that it's the same on both systems, and the truth is technically it's the same on both systems, but in real world use there is a difference. An image from an APS-C camera and an image from a full frame camera are exactly the same in every way, except that it is more zoomed in on the APS-C camera, usually about 1.5 or 1.6 times depending on the camera you have. So if you use a 35mm lens on a full frame camera, it'll look like a 35mm photo. If you use a 35mm lens on an APS-C camera, it'll still have the look and feel and all the characteristics of a 35mm lens. It'll just be zoomed in 1.5 times and have a field of view of a 52.5mm lens. Matter of fact, I can take the image from the APS-C camera and place it within the full frame image and they match. Same amount of blur and everything, and in some cases the APS-C area will be even more detailed than the full frame image, and I'll explain why later. So what affects the amount of background blur that your image has? There are only three factors: focal length, distance, and aperture. If those things are the same, then no matter what camera you use, the background blur will be the same. So people who say that APS-C cameras have the same amount of background blur as a full frame camera are right, because sensor size has nothing to do with it. But let's say I want to get the same field of view with my APS-C camera as my full frame camera. What do I have to do? Either use a wider lens or back up. Using a wider lens changes the focal length, and backing up obviously changes the distance. So since you change one of those three factors, the amount of background blur changes. These differences, however, can be exploited with both cameras. For example, it's easier to get a wide shot with a full frame camera, and it's easier to get a tight shot with an APS-C camera. This is a 70 to 200mm lens, and if I put it on a full frame camera, that's what I would get. But if I put it on an APS-C camera, that increases by 1.5 times, and I now have a 105 to 300mm equivalent lens. But let's say your bright idea is to say, well, I'll just crop in on my full frame image and I'll get the same field of view, and that's true. But remember what I said about the APS-C sometimes being a higher quality? This Sony a6700 has an APS-C sensor with 26 megapixels. This A7C Mark II is a full frame camera and has 33 megapixels. If you crop that full frame image to match that APS-C image, you've lost a lot of the information and now you have a 16 megapixel image. Well, that image you got from the A6700 is still the full 26 megapixels. So if you're using a 70 to 200 millimeter lens and you're trying to get this shot, then you're better off using the APS-C camera than the full frame camera. That's not always the case though, because if you use a Sony a7R5, that camera is made to be high resolution, which is why it has 61 megapixels. And if you did the same amount of cropping on a 61 megapixel image, you still have 26 megapixels, which matches the a6700. So with that camera, you basically have the best of both worlds. But there is a downside to that I'll talk about later. To put megapixels in perspective, the posts that you see on Instagram are around 1 or 2 megapixels. An 8x10 print is around 7 megapixels and a 4K image is around 8 megapixels. You can even print a billboard under 16 megapixels and they're usually around 1 to 2 megapixels depending on how far the viewing distance of the billboard will be. So don't get caught up on megapixels unless you know for sure why you need more. Now let's talk about low light, and people always say that full frame cameras are better than APS-C cameras in low light. And generally speaking, that's usually true, but let's go into the details. Your camera sensor contains pixels which capture light, and the bigger those pixels are, the more light that you can capture. So what we have here is basically a balancing act. So if you have a full frame camera like a Sony a7R5, which has a lot of megapixels, you have to squeeze 61 megapixels within the size of that sensor. Because of that, each one of those pixels are going to be pretty small, which is why the a7R5 isn't the best in low light, even though it's a full frame camera. When you look at the Sony a7S III, which is also a full frame camera, it only has 12 megapixels. So those pixels are going to be much bigger than they are on the a7R5, which is why the a7S III is so good in low light. So it all really depends on the goal of the camera. Some cameras are designed to be good in low light, some cameras it's not really a concern. Someone could technically make a APS-C camera with 10 megapixels, which is enough to still have 4K image, and the pixels will be pretty big, which means that camera should be pretty good in low light. But you also have to remember that these camera companies are businesses and it has to make business sense. If the audience for that camera isn't as big as it is for some of the other cameras, then most likely that camera might not be made, even though theoretically it could be. So what usually ends up happening is these cameras are designed to split the difference. They try to have as many megapixels as possible to give you a high resolution image, but not too many that you start to suffer some of the things that high resolution cameras aren't good at. Historically speaking, high-end cinema cameras have always sucked in low light. But because of how these cameras are used on big budget movie sets, they have lighting and time to set all these things up. So it doesn't really matter how good or bad their camera is in low light because they're lighting their scenes. Just like a lot of users who have the Sony a7R5. Many of those people don't care about how bad or good it is in low light because they're using it in the studio or for high-end prints for galleries and things like that. So the low light capabilities of that camera is not really a concern to them. They need resolution. Now let's put all of this in perspective. Bad back then is not bad now. Even the cameras that we don't consider to be good in low light are still more than enough most of the time. A lot of times when I see people struggling with their camera in low light, it's almost like they want the camera to see in the dark. And there are cameras specifically made for that. So a lot of times I think people aren't being realistic on what they expect from a camera and being able to perform in low light. Low light means low light, not no light. I also think from the perspective of someone who maybe can only afford to get an APS-C camera and they see noise in the image, they just automatically assume that a full frame camera would just completely change the game for them because they maybe have never used a full frame camera and don't know realistically what it's like to have a full frame camera and what those results are. And I think a lot of times they would be surprised that even if they had a full frame camera, in some situations that people complain about, it would be noisy too. Another thing that I see people do is zooming way into the image and saying, look, I see grain. This is an OLED HDR TV with a beautiful image. But guess what? If I zoom way in, I can see pixels. But I wouldn't say the image on the TV is pixelated. So if you look at an image in the way that it's intended to be viewed and the noise isn't ruining that experience, it's fine. Sometimes I literally hear people complain about noise in their image from conditions like this. And this is what it looks like on the APS-C camera. And this is what it looks like on the full frame camera. And I really can't even tell if it's in focus or not. But if it is in focus, the background blur on the full frame camera is probably better, which might make this look a little better. But both of these cameras are struggling in this situation. And now that I've added some light, I think both of these cameras are doing a little better. Of course, the full frame camera is performing better than the APS-C camera, which is expected, but I think both of these images pass for sure. So yes, a full frame camera can and often performs better than a APS-C camera in low light, but a school bus can carry more people than a sports car. If it's only you riding in it, it doesn't matter how many people the bus can hold because it only has to carry you. Most full frame and APS-C cameras will get the job done most of the time. I am no less confident in my A6700 in low light than I am with any of my full frame cameras. Now, if you often find yourself in extreme situations, then it might make more sense for you to get a full frame camera, just like it might make sense for you to have a bus if you have to transport a basketball team all the time. Now, of course, if you're looking at some of the older cameras, you might want to weigh your options because technology has advanced over the years. And I think that maybe, a few years ago, then maybe so. Maybe you might see a bigger difference between an APS-C camera in low light than full frame. But nowadays, I think most manufacturers at this point have it pretty good. Now, I know throughout this video, I've made a lot of points on why you should get an APS-C camera, but am I going to be one of those people who tell you to do that while I go off and do something completely different? I'm literally filming on a full frame camera right now. Contrary to some people's belief, there is a full frame look, or else it wouldn't exist in the first place. Remember how I said that if you use an APS-C camera, you usually have to use a wider lens or back up to get the same field of view that a full frame camera has? Because I don't have to do that with a full frame camera, I can get a wider shot without losing that background blur that I would lose if I changed lens to a wider focal length or backed up. That tends to give your subject a little more separation. Realistically speaking, in most cases, you'll never notice these things unless I put the same image side by side. If you scroll through any of my videos, you'll never notice which ones were shot with a full frame camera and which ones were shot with an APS-C camera. And depending on your style of work, it might not make a difference either way, but it is a thing. That also applies to cameras with a medium format sensor. 35mm film isn't the biggest film, so full frame cameras don't have the biggest sensors. So everything I said about APS-C cameras in relation to full frame cameras, the same applies with full frame cameras to medium format cameras. I can get an even wider shot than full frame with even more background separation with a medium format camera than I can with a full frame camera. So much so that medium format cameras often have this 3D looking effect to their images. But now you have a bigger camera and a bigger lens setup, and it's much harder to get a zoomed in shot because remember that 70-200 example I gave earlier? Well, that same lens on some digital medium format cameras now will be a 55-158mm lens. So at the end of the day, it's really a wonderful time to own a camera because you really can't go wrong. Every single one will have its own pros and cons, which is why we don't have a perfect camera. You have so many different cameras on the market because you have so many different types of users, and that's a wonderful thing. So if you end up getting or you have an APS-C camera, you're no less than someone who has a medium format camera. And if you have a medium format camera, you're no more than someone who has an APS-C camera. At the end of the day, the only thing that matters is the final result. So I hope I answered any questions that you guys may have. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comments down below. Follow me on Instagram, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next one.